Great question. So temptation doesn't actually exist, not in the way that I think we tend to think about it. I think we tend to think of temptation in the same way that we think of sin, like it's something that's in us or it's something that's tangible or spiritual, but it's really not. What temptation is the experience that we have when we face a moment where our desires fall out of alignment with God's intentions. I think actually a better way to say it would be when our desires fall out of alignment with God's designs. So let's take the Garden of Eden, for example. You have Eve, who is within God's design, which is God placed them in a perfect world, perfect environment, and the design was for God to walk with them, and as they matured, reveal to them all the things that he wanted to reveal, but in its time, and through him as a trustworthy source, right? The problem was Satan was able to come in and demonstrate to Eve that she lacked the ability, the wisdom, to evaluate whether God was actually teaching her good or teaching her evil, because she lacked the ability to delineate between those two things. Essentially, God could have been doing evil to her or teaching her incorrectly, and she would have had no way to know the difference. And so in that moment, Eve was faced with a difficult quandary. It's the question of, well, do I continue on in ignorance and just trust that God is going to reveal all of this stuff to me in its time, and can I even trust that? Or do I eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which gives me the ability to evaluate God separately from the things that he's told me? Or maybe another way to put it is to evaluate his ways separately from what he's told me about them. And so in that moment, Eve experienced temptation because she was faced with a desire for something that was outside of God's original design. And really, I think you could say that about pretty much everything. I think really all temptation could probably be categorized in that way. That it is when we face a moment where we have a desire for something, but there is a way in which to acquire it through God's ways, and then there is a way in which to acquire it separately or on our own. And of course, there's a number of reasons why we might want to acquire something on our own. It could be the desire to assert our autonomy. It could be it could just be a simple lack of patience, like we just don't want to wait. Oftentimes, the things that God creates for us require long-term sustained effort. I mean, this is kind of like the nature of quality. Quality things require time and effort and energy and expertise, all things that don't happen overnight. It's like a good marriage doesn't just happen. A good marriage happens over time and relationship and struggle and sacrifice, and there's a lot of effort that you have to put into it. Theoretically, the way it should work is we have a desire for the temporal pleasure of intimacy with the opposite sex, right? And that desire drives us to the relationship. Now, in that moment, we have a decision to make about whether we're going to acquire the intimacy separately from the covenant of marriage, which is the way that God designed it, or whether we're going to engage the covenant of marriage, and by doing that, it puts the intimacy, which is the thing that we desire, behind kind of a paywall in a way, because you now can't just go out, pick somebody up, get what you want, and leave with no consequence. Now you have to engage and maintain the relationship, because if you don't maintain the relationship, then the intimacy goes away and then you don't get the thing that you want, right? However, if you do it God's way, what you end up with is a depth of relationship that is difficult to get, really, I'd say maybe impossible to get anywhere else, because the becoming one with another person and then doing life together in a marriage is a very unique construct that isn't really replicated in any other area of life. And so when it's done well, there is a massive benefit, both experientially, but also in who you become through that process. And then simultaneously, if you go outside side of that. If we say, okay, we don't like God's way because we're impatient and we want to have intimacy right now with whatever partner we want, and we don't want it behind the paywall, then what you end up with is STDs, broken hearts, divorces, or not divorces, but unwanted pregnancies, right? Which then, could roll into abortion. There's a whole argument that can be made about that, right? So a whole multitude of things that come, damage that is created by our impatience in chasing down that desire. So in summary, this is something substantial that we could probably talk in a lot more depth about. But in summary, temptation is not something that God created. Temptation is the experience that we have when we are faced with the conflict of desiring something separately from God's designs and having to then make a choice between whether we're going to trust that God's ways to acquire the thing that we desire are better, or whether we are going to not trust God and then just do it on our own. And as always, if you're watching this video and you enjoyed this content, if there's anything else I could talk about that you feel would be beneficial to you or others, drop it in the comments and I'll make another video.